The special thing about a portrait, which distinguishes it from a landscape painting or a still life painting, is that three people are involved. You have the sitter, you have the painter, and you have the onlooker. Three people. So it's quite different to any other form of painting, as a matter of fact. Whilst going through this particular portrait session, what I want to try to do is to give you some indication, as far as possible, of what simply are the basic rules, if there are any rules. I can only give you my rules as a professional painter. The simplest way is always the best. Most people who paint because they enjoy painting as a hobby tend to be very often confused because there are so many things available to them, so many materials available to them, so many processes available, and they don't actually ever seem to get down to what really is a very simple practice. So let me try to outline one to you. I think before I set the model up, that's to say, before I ask the model to take a particular pose, which is very important, how the model sits, because she's going to have to remain still for a considerable amount of time. So it's not just a question of sit down in the chair and I'll paint your picture. It's a question of sitting in a particular way that you will be able to analyze what you're looking at, and she won't move very much. Before I set the model up, what I would like to do is to outline to you one or two basic things about the use of paint and brushes. I'd like to talk about colour, very simply and quite quickly. Colour is the whole secret of painting, because the difference between painting and drawing is that drawing is tonal in terms of light and dark, invariably. Unless you use pastel, which is coloured chalks, you're not involved in colour. Painting is the balance of colour into shape, into form. And in order to use it, you've got to have a formula. It's not a question really of just choosing the colours you like, because many of the colours you like probably won't blend and won't, if you like, mix into something which is manageable. So you've got to have a system. So I think the system really, if I can outline it to you, my system ranges from the coolest colour, the blues, to the warmest colours, through the reds, to a yellow. And right in the middle is the thing which most colour is mixed with, which is not colour itself at all, and that is flake white. So let's just put the white in the middle. I find it's always a very good thing to do, because you can always pick it up to take to the cold colours, or pick it up and take to the warm colours. And then if you take a blue, cobalt is the blue that I use. And cobalt, in fact, is a blue which will certainly synchronise and blend with all of these colours. And we take yellow. There are two yellows. There's lemon yellow and there's yellow ochre. Lemon yellow is an extremely useful yellow, very acidy colour. It's extremely useful because you can lighten other colours with it. And that's something a lot of people don't realise, that instead of actually lightening all the time with white, which you ought not to do, but if you keep lightening with white, what's happening is that you're actually just reducing the colour content invariably. You can lighten with lemon. Now then, to take the reds, take the darkest of the reds, which is an umber, a burnt umber, dark brown. If I just spread it there, you'll be able to see it. Very earthy brown. And then two other reds. Indian red, which I keep to the left nearer the cool colours because it's a cool red, and light red, which tonally is almost exactly the same as the Indian red. I think you can see that they hardly seem to differ at all. But in a moment I'm going to explain to you that this is the whole key to this palette, these two reds. As far as the blue is concerned, any greens you would need, you'd simply add cobalt blue to a little lemon, and you've got a green. But there's always, I find, the use of another green, which you can mix with the greys and the colours you're going to make. And the one I tend to use is oxide of chromium, which really is not a rich green like sap green or viridian, but I find it a very useful one. Now, so we go from the cold to the warm. Now, as we paint, as we're painting a portrait, the need for greys, warm and cold greys in flesh colours, is really the whole basis of what it's about. It's not a landscape, not a still life, it's a figure painting and it's a face. And you need the warm and the cold. Always think of colour as warm and cold. Don't just think of it as a colour you like and a colour you dislike. Think of it as a formula to actually use. And you must make greys, because wherever anything goes into the shadow, if you take my hand now, as my hand moves around there and moves into there, there's a shadow. Now that shadow is becoming bluer. The shadow of my hand on my hand means that there is blue inside there. The light is being cut off, so therefore there is blue, the inclusion of blue in every shadow. So you need two greys. So we'll make a grey. Now a grey is not black and white, because black and white is not colour. So let's just make two greys. Now we're going to use a blue, the same blue, cobalt with each of them. Let's try and get them both the same consistency. Now the two reds, the key to the whole business of painting the face, the light red, the Indian red. The Indian red is cooler, the light red is warmer, nearer to the yellow. So let's just add a little light red to that. And immediately we get a grey, a beautiful warm grey. If I add some white to the corner, you'll see it lighten there. And you see a light grey. See the light grey coming. Now, I'll add the cool red. And immediately you can see, I hope, that that is becoming more violet. I can see it clearly as violet. That is going towards red and brown. This is going towards violet and towards the purples. If I add some white to the corner of that, you'll see a grey which is a cool grey. Now, can you see the difference between these now? That's what painting is really all about. It's about the subtle variance between these colours. And it's about the subtle variance, in this particular case, with the face, with these variants of greys which you're going to find in the shadows and the greys going nearer to the highlights. Now let's talk about the canvas, or the surface that the picture is going to be painted on. Canvas is something which originally was used simply because you could have a roll of it, you could stretch it, put it across the stretcher, you could take it off the stretcher and roll it up, and it was easily portable. Other alternative surfaces to paint on other than canvas were, of course, wood panels, which were the original surfaces, and, of course, wall surfaces such as clay, which were known as tempera. But nowadays, you can buy a board. I tend to prefer painting on a board rather than the canvas, simply because when I paint, and at this point we get to the point about touch. We've talked about colour, I'm going to talk about touch. When we actually paint on a surface, the touch of the brush on the surface is important, because it's a tactile thing, painting. And if the canvas gives way, some painters like the rhythm of the canvas. They use that continually and enjoy it. I don't like a give in the surface I'm painting on, so a board suits me better. The brushes are actually extremely important, because the brushes are, of course, the implement which applies the paint to the canvas. And most people tend immediately to make a basic mistake. They try to use brushes that are too small. I'm showing you two brushes because I want to show you a principle of painting that I have and that I've evolved over the years, which actually is my own way of doing it, and it needs two totally different kinds of brushes to do it. Most people tend to use small brushes because their natural inclination is to draw with the paint rather than paint with it. And I'd say to you simply that the bigger the brush, the more you are likely to paint. The smaller the brush, the more you're inclined to draw. So really, you could say that if the brush was almost too big for you to control properly, you would still be painting. If the brush was too small, you would undoubtedly be drawing. And that is a basic principle which I think is very important. I use these two brushes simply in this way, that this one, as you'll see, will be a marker. It won't actually contribute very much to the painting, other than to be, if you like something which anchors a certain movement of paint. It makes a dot, or it makes a cut. It's like a knife, as a matter of fact. The larger brush will actually apply the paint in differing ways. There's a solvent that is always used to carry the paint. Now you can use oil, linseed oil, or you can use distilled turpentine. I tend to prefer to use turpentine simply because it doesn't become as greasy as linseed oil does, and if you ever want to make it oily and full of sort of the glaze that you get with oil, you can always rub oil into the picture when you come back to work on it first thing in the morning, if it's taking you more than one session or one sitting. But I find turpentine extremely practicable. It dries quickly, it allows you to use thinner layers of paint, and I think really for general purposes the turpentine is somehow or another much more attractive. Setting the model is probably the single most important thing that you can do at the beginning of a portrait. If you work really on the supposition that as the portrait grows or as the portrait develops, you are actually learning a great deal about the sitter. That's the whole process. Forget about the idea of what you want to say from your emotions at this point. I think it's much more important that you try objectively to understand what the model looks like, the general basic structure of her. So you set her in a pose in which she's going to be extremely comfortable and not be inclined to move. And when you've done that, you then start to analyze what she looks like. You then start to analyze the shapes and the movements of the actual form and the arrangement of the colors. And your emotions should actually work in conjunction with your understanding of what she looks like. The two things go together. The expression of how you feel about the model will come out of your subliminal senses. It will, if you've got those feelings, it'll just come onto the canvas. So let's just say we're going to set the model now. Now, let's put her in 2 or 3 different positions that you could possibly paint from. Could you actually turn around and look at me? That's right. Now, you could... Now, her face is squarely on now. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, the only thing that's wrong with that is simply that if you look at the angle of the neck, my brush is picking up the angle of the neck. Now, the angle of the neck and the angle of the face are very parallel. Now, without moving your eyes from me, could you tilt your head slightly that way? That's it. Now you've got what's getting closer to what's called a contrapposto. You've got the angle of the neck moving that way through the eye, and you've got the head moving that way. Now that is a much more interesting arrangement than what we had before. Now, if you slowly turn your face away, going that way, turn around a little more, now stop. Now there you have an interesting point, because you have the neck again, you have the angle of the nose and the diagonal running that way, but you also have here a clear incision between the line of the shoulder and the neck. Now, without moving very much, could you just drop your chin down? Now, you see what happens now? You lose that indentation, just peeping back again. That indentation is very important because it will help you to understand the line of the neck and the arrangement of the neck to the head. So lift your chin up again, just a little. So I think we might actually go for that, because that's a pretty good, it's a fairly good pose. And are you comfortable? It's important to always ask the model if she's comfortable so that she would be able to keep that position. Right, now then, having got to that, the model's comfortable, she's in a position that you feel that you want to start analyzing the shapes and the colors and the way she is, you could actually then start to go through the first procedure. Now, the first procedure is not to actually paint anything on a board, but to actually try to develop a simple and basic understanding of what the structure of the head and the neck and the shoulders is. So let's just go back closer to the model now and look at this. Look at the neck. Always use your brush as something you can look through to see general directions of structure. The neck is moving that way. The shoulders are moving that way. That's what you call a contrapposto. All the great paintings, all the great nudes, the great Michelangelo sculptures reveal a contrapposto. You have that change and shift down through, going like that, all the way up through the Venus de Milo. That's what's very beautiful about the Venus de Milo. So we've got the neck, we've got the brow moving back in line with the nose, and we've got the cheekbones that run like that. So let's see, we've got the neck, we've got the shoulders, we've got the brow,
we've got the cheekbones. Fine. Now we've got all these shapes that are shifting, all these changes of contrapposto. What do we need? We need something to anchor it. We need something that we can use as a spot, which we'll in fact invariably go back to, like, if you like, the whole thing that it's anchored to. Now, I think that you could take the point of the chin, you could take the point of the nose, you could take the back of the hair, you could take that point there. All of those points actually would not be reasonable to take because they're likely to move. And if, now just as I hold that there, very slowly, please just drop your chin. Now you see how that whole shape changes from that. Now put your chin back up again. Now I think the important thing that we've got to do is to find something that is not going to move very much. Now let's take the inside of the eye. Now just lower your chin slowly again. See, that hardly moves from there. Back up again. So we've got a spot that we really know is not going to move radically, and we can keep going back to set everything from. And the important thing is we can trace a vertical from the inside of that eye, right the way down. We can trace a horizontal. We can trace a diagonal. We can keep going back to that one spot as being the main source for the whole anchoring of the picture. Let's put that now onto canvas. Here we have some cobalt blue. There are many different ways you can make the initial marks of a painting. The beginning is always a very difficult thing. I tend to mix a very diluted cobalt blue, so I can make a mark like that. Whatever colors I'm going to use will actually mingle and blend with that blue somehow or another. Or I could even begin to take it off, and then with my rag I could wipe it right off almost. Now, many people like to draw with charcoal. But to me that is drawing. And whatever you do to that afterwards, it's going to stay on the canvas or on the board. I don't like that very much. I think that really is extraneous, and very often what you finish with is a tinted drawing. So let's just imagine we're going to begin as Cézanne began, who was one of the most fastidious colorists of all time. He used cobalt blue in fine marks. So that's how we're going to begin this picture, a diluted form of cobalt blue. The point that we talked about inside the eye as an anchor, and it's most by instinct in a way where you put it now. It's a tendency to feel the sides of the board, to feel instinctively and sublimely where that mark is going to go. There's something actually in painting you can't teach. But let's just make it there. There's going to be the inside of the eye. Now, having done that, you've anchored the thing. You've made a spot to arrest everything. So let's see where it would go to from there. There's no need for any details at this point, but there is a need to actually feel what you're going to be looking at and painting within the shape of this 16 by 20 board. So we start the eye, the nose, Now, at this point, we've marked something in. We've marked it in roughly and loosely. But we've got it again instinctively, as I mentioned before, onto the board in a broad way. Now, that can actually be taken down. And it's very often a good thing to do that, to almost take it out. Because the important thing about painting, the most important thing and the most difficult thing of all, is to keep the whole thing flexible, to keep it in such a way you can change it. And I think it's a good thing at this point to make one difference in the color, and that is to paint that spot at the inside of the eye in another color, because from there everything is going to work. You're going to be able to see what runs vertically down from there. Don't be afraid of making marks on the canvas, because these things can come out and they can guide you and help you. You can see how things will move diagonally. You can see how things will move diagonally in the other way. And start to use the corners of the canvas and the board. So we've got a basis that we can work on. We've got a foundation. And we've got our anchor spot right there. So now we can start to think about the color and the broader shapes. Remember what I said about the warm and the cold grays. Remember about the warm and the cold in terms of flesh colors. Here, with the light red and the white, we're going to make the basis of the flesh color. But as I look at the model, I find that there's a degree of a yellow-brown in it, so I use the ochre. And I'm building up a very thin, translucent, and this is where feeling comes in, where the brush, applying the paint, picking up the paint, mixing the paint. It's a very beautiful, sensuous, marvelous feeling. And it should be something that you almost indulge yourself in. It's not just a question of picking paint up, it's a question of making what the artist calls his madder. So I've got the basis of the flesh color I want to use, and I'm going to use this to mark certain areas in. I'm going to apply now paint which will actually cover the surfaces closest to me. And the formula I use is that those surfaces will be, because they're nearer to me, warmer, lighter, and so I'm using a warm flesh color. And I'm finding the line of the bones. Now the paint, you should feel the paint. Paint has, as I said, inherent beauty of its own. Cézanne said that painting was the application of paint and the destruction of a misunderstood form. It was adding something all the time, and every time you made a mark, it should add to it. And if you get to the point where you don't feel that you can add anything to it, then it's finished. Now, let's just take, for instance, this exercise I'm talking about in warm and cool areas. Now, if we take the eye here, we're going to find an area where it turns, and there's a shadow, a cooler area, but not a dark shadow, not as you would get under the chin. So let me show you the difference between two areas of shadow. This particular part, I'm now going to use a cooler red, the Indian red, to make the shadow. And we'll find the eyeball, the socket where the eye is. And that shadow just underneath the cheekbone there. Now that is so subtle, you can hardly see it, but that's what you want, because suddenly you'll come to an area where you have a much darker shadow, and then underneath there, you can feel it come that way. Now, we have three very subtle areas of differential. That slightly cooler flesh color, the cooler color there, and the darker area underneath the chin. And to make those points, I think we really need to look at the model. Here you can see the areas that I've been talking about. You can see the subtle color. Let's forget the features, forget the eye itself, and the nostrils, and the lips. They're very small parts, and yet they're the senses, so everybody looks at them and they draw them in first. Leave them alone. They're the last things to go in. The eye, the nostrils, the lips, the ear. Tiny little things. Look at that huge area of flesh there. That huge area of neck. It's much more important to paint that. I mean, you wouldn't actually paint a window before you painted a wall. Or at least if you did, it wouldn't be very sensible. So let's just take that area of subtle color there, where my brush is now moving. Forgetting the eyeball itself. And then there, underneath the cheekbone. And then there, the darker, richer shadow. And it's blue. Might not look immediately blue to you, but you've got to have a formula. And blue is the elimination of the warm colours by the absence of light, so it becomes blue. So let's just look back at the picture itself now. Now, to see how really subtle that is, because these shadows, that is the strongest mark that we've got so far. That's the darkest area of tone in the picture. So let's just think a minute about colour, about the cool area, the warm area, the shadow which gets cooler. Let's also think about tone. Tone is very important. Tone is what drawing is about. Tone is the finding of the form, the light and the dark. Here we've got half tones. That's what painting is all about. That's the most difficult thing in the world. Here you've got the strong shadow under the chin. That doesn't look like a half tone. That looks like a very dark tone. Until, for instance, we can immediately at this point start to put in something which really is darker, the dark, rich hair. And then you'll see how these become suddenly light. Now, we find now that that colour, that warm colour, is now becoming a half tone too, because these are becoming rich and very dark areas. We should at this point too consider that we need another colour. We need another colour to come in where you have the bodice of the blouse. Now that colour, I don't have a colour as bright and red as that in the formula of my palette, so I need to include it. And I need to include it at this point, because it's very important to have the balance of relationship between the half tones, the darkest areas, and the brightest in colour, and the background. So we come to them all in turn. And what I'm trying to do is to build up something all over this board. So you've got something flexible, and you're not getting tight into any part of it. So I have to include another red. I need to go back to my palette and to put in the one other colour which is needed to actually complete the palette. The red I'm going to use is a simple bright red. I'll put it amongst the reds on the warm side. Now as I look at that red, I can see that it has a totally different relationship of colour to any of the other reds. The other reds are subtle, they'll make greys. This will simply be a red, which I'm going to use for the bodice of the blouse. And I need it in at this moment. I need it in because I need to balance the colours all over the canvas or all over the board. Remember the indentation which we saw right at the beginning between the chin and the bodice. Now even in the shadows there I can see blue-violet coming in the front of the bodice. So I'm going to take a little blue and add it to the colour I've got and bring something slightly cooler subtly in there, even at this stage. And then in the darkened area where we go into the shadow, underneath the arm, I can bring that in. Now, there's one important element that a lot of people, when they paint, tend to forget about and think that it'll take care of itself just by being put in at the end, like you might put wallpaper on a wall to cover a surface. And that's the background. The background is extremely important. I see the background around the head as being a sort of violet blue. So I must mix something. I must at this point get it in because it has to be subtly related to all of these things. But it must be subtle because the head itself is darker than the background. Now, at the moment it's darker than the background, but it's a very subtle difference. Now, just to show you what I mean about getting it out of key, I can make the violet of the background, or a violet, and I can put the violet, I put a violet in, and you'll see that this violet will probably turn out to be darker than the face. Yes, just subtly darker than the face. Now that is totally out of key, because the face itself must be darker in the background. So that's a point of readjustment I've got to make. But I know that I've got to make this white violet, so I'm going to put some more of it in. I'll lighten it slightly, but I still must have it in. I want to feel the presence of this violet all around the model. Now to bring the flesh colours back, warmer and richer. And now I'll have to start painting quicker. And just for a moment, I won't disturb you by saying anything, but I'll just start to actually correct the tonal relationship by making the face darker and paint fluidly and quickly so you can see how it grows and how flexible it must remain. Now the model has moved. I can see that the model has moved, so I can correct a position because I still can detect this point in there. So what I do is I mark the point in again, the inside of the eye. Now could you turn slightly away? That's it. Everything is flexible. Everything should be able to be moved. Now we get to a point where there are a few important areas which really are emerging strongly in my understanding of this shape. One of them is the position coming down vertically from there, where the neck and the shoulder meet. So I must now arrest that. I must now make a point here as I've made a point there. And it comes at a slight diagonal, so it will come there. Now I make that point, and I'm going to keep to that. So if when I look at the model, that relationship in the model changes, well, I know she's moved. There's another point which is important, that here in the chin, there is an angle that comes to the back of the head. Always relate around, everywhere. Move all over the canvas, all over the board. Relating shapes, bringing that in line with something down here, bringing that point of the neck in line with something down there, bringing that point of the eye in line with that point there, and so on. But this here is very strong, so that must be marked very, very strongly in it. The point where the jawbone begins and starts to come around. The line of the neck coming down there, and the cheekbone. So I'm beginning to get an almost geometric shape here. And I'm playing around with that variance of shape. I'm forgetting colour for the moment, I'm looking at shape. That's the point of this kind of scalpel. Now I must come back to colour. You can't let the thing run away. You can't get too strongly involved in one area. You've got to keep changing it around. You've got to come back to colour, and go back to shape. Colour, shape, tone, warm, cold. All these things have got to work at once and keep it all flexible and open. Nothing's got to be tight. The easiest thing in the world, the greatest temptation in the world is to actually move into be painting the details. You've got to stop doing that. You've got to ask the model continually to stay very still and not move. And then you can actually move your eye across all the shapes, forgetting the details. It's so easy. I'll show you how you can paint the details. Then you might think it's finished. Now it doesn't add anything to it because it's in the wrong place. I can see that immediately. It's too soon to come to that. So I must get them out and resist that temptation. There's so much more discovery to be made before we get to that point. So let's go back to the colour. The warm areas on the brow. I want to darken the tones on the face enough to allow lighter areas to come back in on it. Something that is extremely important, one of the most primarily important things to consider at all, is that when you're painting a portrait like this, you are actually making a study. You're not making a picture as such. The picture comes out of the study. But what you're doing is you're making a study. If you believe that from the beginning, you'll be less inclined to try to make a picture. That is, you'll be less inclined to try to think about it as a finished object at any time during its development. And the important thing is keeping it open. I'll keep saying that time and time again. Because when I was a student, I remember that was the one thing that became the most important awareness to me. I remember one day when I was at the Slade School, I was painting like this in the life room, and Augustus John, who was a visiting artist at that time, came in, and he made one comment about the picture, which I think has stayed with me all my life. And he said, remember to look and analyze. Keep it open like a piece of plasticine in your fingers. And your emotions, if you've got any, will take care of themselves. And I always thought that that was a very important lesson. What I'm doing now is I'm moulding the plasticine, as it were. I'm feeling the paint. Never be stingy with paint. One of the things is that you get an awful lot of people who paint, and they think, in a sense, it's a kind of, well, I don't know, some sort of process of conserving the paint because the paint costs money. I mean, if you're sitting down and you're painting, you should really be thinking about doing it as well as you possibly can and not thinking about really how much paint you're using. So always keep plenty of paint. Don't be too lazy to squeeze a colour out. I think you'll pick another one up. Don't use colours you like. Use colours that you see and discover. See how flexible it's staying. Now I take the scalpel, and with the cobalt, I call it the scalpel because it's cutting the shapes in. I start to cut in again. Sooner or later I'm going to come to a point where I feel that I've cut it into some kind of accurate assessment of what I'm looking at. And then I won't need to add much more to it, and I'll know that I'm getting near to finishing it. Come down. Feel the neck. Neck is a column. Now there is a spot of red where the lips are. I want to use that as a point of reference from this point on to keeping up with the inside of the eye. There is some brown, umber is the brown I've got. There's some brown on the top of the eye. And that makes a shape which runs back. But the most important shape runs straight across, right across there, and into the point where the hair comes. Manet once said that if you want to paint an eye, don't actually paint the eye itself, but paint all the things around it, and the eye will evolve itself. And that's true. And well. Now I need to see the darker parts coming. Keep your eyes open. And there's a lot of blue in that dark area there. If you want to make something really dark, the way to do it with the palette we've got is add the blue and the brown, add the cobalt and the umber, which I'm doing now. That's coming almost as dark as you would need it to come. Now we can see how light that becomes. The paint has a beautiful wet quality, but it also has a texture when it dries. Remember, it's a study. Tell yourself that time and again. It's a study. I'm discovering all the time. Don't worry what it looks like. Think to yourself, even at the end of this, if I scrub it all off, what's going to happen is that I'm going to be left with a greater understanding of what making a picture is. And I will have developed my own awareness. No. It's getting far too white. There's a lot of white paint. White paint isn't colour, and that's troubling me a lot now. So I want to make this richer. I want to see the difference between the violet areas and the rich flesh. Keep checking up always the verticals, the horizontals, the diagonals. Right, so before I get into the rich part there, I need another key here. This is darker in reality than the flesh, so I need to darken that. Make it jump as a colour. Now what I need to do is very strong, firm lines in the model's face. And these are the things to look for, these very strong, basic shapes of the jaw, the neck, the brow, the cheekbones. But I need to make it richer. And then we'll get to the point where we can close it. Almost as if the study there's enough information come for this study, so we would need to sacrifice it and perhaps begin another one. And I want it richer and warmer. And where I'm going to lighten the areas as we go on, I'm going to lighten them by using colour, by mixing lemon yellow in with the flesh colour. See, this area here is light. I don't want to use white necessarily, I want to use lemon. So you'll see the lemon that I'm mixing now. Lighten the colour, but not make it whiter. Very subtle. There, a broad shape. There is a broad shape. There is a broad shape. And there. And in the shadows, we get a richer, browner colour. Now it's evening out somehow. The rhythm is moving now. I'm beginning to find the shapes bigger, stronger, more easily. I can find warmer colours and colder colours in the shadows. I'm starting to put colour in again. I've left tone for a moment. I'm thinking about colour. All over there, under the hair. It's darker. Now I want to tie up the surroundings with it. Before I do that, I'll soften that. And I'll soften that. Highlights the lightest parts and the darkest parts right at the end. I need to bring and relate this background a little more. So I want some more violet in it. You might wonder why there's a lot of space around the head. how I'm going to organize that. Well, I'm going to organize it by using very subtle grey areas and violet areas to bring your attention into the head. So that always the eye is drawn across the board. And the thing that draws you across it is paint. Paint which is making tone and shadows. Here there's a warm shadow, higher up. And here we have a bluer shadow behind the hair. And high up in that part of the picture where you're moving away from the head, needs to be dark too. Allow the paint to look like paint. Don't worry about it looking finished like a wall. What you're doing is you're using paint. The paint has got to assume certain qualities. It becomes almost magical in your hands, or should be. But it should always remain like paint. And it's going to be a study. It's going to be something which will be a point of reference for your understanding of the sitter. There's a shadow under there. As I said to you before, think about the shadow. The highlights are going to come in right at the end. Think about the shadows, subtle shadows. So let's put some subtle changes in now. Now we can mark in the things closest to the end. And as we're closing it, I can see some light blue in the hair. And the hair itself, here's where the brush itself can make marvelous magical lines. Find the hair. One of the important things, the most important thing, is never to lose the feeling for the paint and the brush. The broad brush can give you effects of texture. To take the hair that will move around the model's head, that where the hair becomes lighter and more linear, you can make the impression of the delicacy of it. You can bring it to the back where it just goes off. And then you can scratch it and make certain definite marks where the hair at times could have a definite texture. Remembering that the darkest marks I'm making on here are blue and umber. There's no black. I haven't needed any black. These are dark colours, real colours. Nothing to do with black. You can always bring the white of the board back when you want it to, like that. Children are marvellous with paint. They love to feel it in their fingers. They love to splash it. Now we're getting to a point quite close to the end of this picture where somehow or another the character of the model is seemingly, I feel, coming. I'm beginning to know her. I think really what I would like to do at this point is draw your attention to something that is really very, very important. And that is that what you're doing is studying. You're learning. I've said that time and again. You've kept it flexible. Little things, little marks. The buttons on the blouse you should hardly miss. The highlights, the small white marks which occur in places where the light falls most radically, should come right at the end. And when you get right to the end, I think the thing that you ought to be prepared to do most of all, and if there's one lesson that you could perhaps learn most strongly, anchoring, going back, moving all over. If there's one lesson that you should learn most clearly, that is that this is a process of study. You can look at the model, you can look at this, and you think to yourself, any mark I make now might not add to it. So what do? You keep the whole thing open, you get rid of it all. You leave the ghost of what was with the hopes of what will be, and what will be, one hopes, will be a greater amount of understanding and knowledge about making a portrait, so the next time should be better. If there's one thing that I'd like to say most strongly, it's that painting is not a precious thing. It's a process of discovery. The painting of a portrait is a discovery of a relationship between you and the sitter. It's a relationship of your understanding of what she, in this case, is, and your feelings will come out automatically. The important issue is it's not precious. It should be something that is a discovery. Every mark you make, you add to your understanding of your awareness of what she is and your own subliminal awareness of painting. Don't think that every time you're painting, you're making a picture. You're making a study. You're making a discovery. A landscape is something else. It's nothing to do with the same warm and cold colors of grayness. It's something to do with yourself and the inanimate nature, very often, of a landscape, of fields, of trees, of bridges, of water, of sky. They're totally different problems. But if the same principle applies. It is a process of discovery. It's a process of making studies. The studies become images which are called pictures.